On any given day, there are 2.7 million children who currently have a parent incarcerated in America. And over 10 million people have experienced a parent behind bars at some point in their lives. This is not a unique story. This is a part of the American story. From the lenses of young adults, this podcast explores the harm of poverty, mass incarceration, the beauty and resilient relationships, and the pain of fractured bones. Join our co-hosts as they enter the sanctuary with our guests in this episode of If Only You Knew.
Hi, my name is Mia.
My name is Elias Fernandez.
Welcome to our sanctuary. Today we have with us Whitney. And we just want you to introduce yourself and tell a bit of your story.
Sure. So, hi. Nice to meet you guys. Nice to be here with you guys. My name is Whitney Hollins. Dr. Whitney Q. Hollins. Oh. Yes, I'm working on adding that to stuff now, right? Yes. I earned it. I'm working on adding to stuff. And so, yeah, I'll start sort of back at the beginning because it took me to where I am now. I am the child of a formerly incarcerated parent. So my father did 3 separate bids, 2 when I was really young, elementary school age, and I don't remember so much. The third one is the most prominent to me. When I was 11, he was incarcerated again, and this time he did federal time, and he was sentenced to 22 years. And he actually did 20 of the 22 years, so he didn't come home until I was 31. And during that time, growing up, he was so many different locations. So if you have experience with people who are incarcerated in the federal system, number one, the prisons are in very rural, out of the way places. And also they tend to move around a lot. So I think at one point my dad was in Ohio, New Jersey, Kentucky, just everywhere. And that was really difficult for my family and my grandma. I have a younger brother who I think took it really, really hard and didn't understand. And I think I took it hard in my own way, but we had very different responses to it. So the last time my father was incarcerated, I didn't see him for the whole 20 years. The previous 2 times I did go to visit him because he was in state jail and he was closer, and my grandma would come and she would take us. My mom wasn't interested anymore. Their relationship had deteriorated by that point. She wasn't in the mood to go take us to see our father. And then when he went to federal prison, my grandma continued her visits. But by this time, I was kind of going into, he got locked up when I was 11. So I was really going into those teenage years. And I had a whole attitude about it. I was like, I'm not spending my whole weekends driving to Kentucky. I don't like going there. I don't like how it feels. And so I did not see him the whole time he was incarcerated for the last bid. He would call and I would answer inconsistently. Sometimes it would really upset me to talk to him before I would go to school. And so because I didn't want to go to school in that frame of mind, I would avoid the calls. And because him and my mom weren't on great terms, she wasn't really pressing me like, oh, you have to talk to your dad, answer the phone. She was kind of like, well, whatever, it's up to y'all.
It is what it is.
Yeah, that's how she was. She was like, it is what it is. He is where he is. You are where you are. If you want to talk to him, you can. If you don't, you don't. And so most of the time I communicated with my father, it was when my grandmother was around because I knew it was really important to her. So if he called and I was at my grandma's house, and sometimes she set it up, right? Like, Whitney's going to be here, so call at this time. And he would call and we would speak to him. And it continued that way until he came home. And now looking back on it, I feel, a lot more empathy for my dad than I did at the time. I was a teenager. I was a lot about me. Well, what about me? But, when my dad was incarcerated, both of his grandparents died. He wasn't able to attend the funeral. His sister committed suicide. He wasn't able to attend the funeral. And so my grandma, that's why another reason I was really adamant about at least trying for my grandma, because she had already lost one of her children. And now my dad was her only child she had left. So she was never going to give up on him. And so I tried really hard to, at least maintain some relationship for her. And I think the biggest turning point in my dad's relationship is actually when I had my own son, because then I understood how many mistakes you can make as a parent and how that's not really a reflection of how much you love your child. Sometimes you're still a person, and as a person, you have your own things going on and you do dumb stuff. But that doesn't mean that you love your kid any less. That just means that you're a human being. Now, unfortunately for my dad, that ended up, with him imprisoned. And I'm lucky that that's not how it ended for me, but I just had a greater understanding of those type of mistakes, and how that can affect you, and, how it can affect your child, even if you don't intend for it to. But yeah, so dad was incarcerated for almost every graduation there could be. And now there's graduations for everything, right? There's pre-K graduation, kindergarten, but,
Yes.
but high school graduation. I graduated from high school. I graduated from undergrad. I graduated for my master's. My dad didn't make it home for a graduation until I got my doctorate. So maybe I just kept going to school until he was he was here to come to a graduation, right? But I ended up working in New York. I went to college in New York. And I ended up becoming a teacher. I was a teaching fellow. And so I taught special ed in New York. And I remember the kids are like always super interested in your life, right? They're like, Miss, who do you live with? Yeah. What do you do? So I was like, I live alone. And they're like, your mom doesn't live with you? I was like, no, she lives in North Carolina. They're like, well, what do you do when you get sick? And I was like, take care of myself, unfortunately. But yeah. And at one point they asked me where my dad was. And for me, a lot of the conversation around parental incarceration deals with stigma and, how sometimes kids are taught not to talk about it. And I never had that pressure put on me to, keep this a secret. It's not something that I openly shared, but that's like me with a lot of things where I just don't go out of my way to share. But if someone asked me about it, I would be fully transparent. So when the kids asked me, well, if your mom lives here, where does your dad live? I was like, oh, my dad's in jail. And they were like, oh, okay. And mind you, like elementary school kids are like the least judgmental people ever. You can tell them anything and they're just like, oh, okay, fine. But two things happened from that conversation. One was that the kids started to share with me that they had incarcerated family members. And two, I had an adult in the building tell me that I really shouldn't tell people about this because they may look at me differently. And I was confused. I was like, I'm a grown woman. I've done this, and this. How does me telling you what someone else, I don't even want to say what someone else did, what someone else's experience is, what does that have to do with me and what you think of me? Like, that sounds like a you problem, right? That doesn't sound like a me problem. Exactly. But in terms of the kids, I know this sounds weird, but it was like the first time that I took parental incarceration out of a personal context and realized that it's like a larger issue. Because growing up, it was me and my family. Like, obviously, I have my brothers, so they also have an incarcerated parent. But there was no community in the sense that I knew so-and-so had an incarcerated parent and this person had an incarcerated parent. And I knew we were going through the same things. I didn't know that. Now that I've looked at the numbers, I'm like, yeah, probably. There were other families, but I had no clue. So this is the first time I'm thinking, I'm like, well, if there are kids dealing with this, like, where do they go? What do they do? What is the school doing for them? And so I started to sort of look into that, and I was a special education teacher. So special education is its own thing, where you get a lot more detailed information on the kids that you're working with. They try to do a social history on the kid where they speak to the parents and get all this background. So I had a lot more access to information on my kids than, let's just say, a general education teacher would. So there were some students that I was able to see, like, oh, they do have an incarcerated parent, or this is why they may be in foster care, or whatever the case may be. But there was no system to tell which kids had an incarcerated parent and who didn't. So that was one thing. I was like, okay, so then how do you go about supporting them in schools if no one knows? So I decided that I was going to go back and do my doctorate. And I did my doctorate at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I always tell everyone this story. The first day of classes, we had to sit in a circle. We're like in this cohort. And they're like, okay, we want everyone to go around and say what you feel like your research interest may be. And so they started to the person like right beside me. So that means I was going to be last, right? And no one wants to be last because then everyone takes everything that you're going to say. So I'm like, oh my goodness. And everyone had these like really super intellectual sounding topics. They were like, I'm going to study cross-intersectionality.
Like what?
I was like, So now I'm getting kind of intimidated, right? Because I was like, I didn't look up any of the words that I'm supposed to know to give you. And they got to me, and at first I kind of chickened out. They were like, okay, well, what are you thinking about studying? And I was like, oh, well, maybe, standardized testing with special education students, which is something that I'm, interested in as a special education teacher. But what I really wanted to study with children of incarcerated parents. And I just didn't know if that was like a topic that people actually studied. And so I don't know what came over me, but like at the last minute, I was like, or I might want to study, you know, children with incarcerated parents. And then everyone was like, fascinating. Why? And I was like, well, you know, because
it's a real thing.
Right. And at the time, my dad was still locked up. When I started my doctorate, my dad was still incarcerated. So I was like, you know, this is a real thing. It's happening to me when I was younger. Now it's happening with the kids that I'm teaching. And I didn't have a community and I don't know what's available. I'm like, I'm not saying nothing's available, but it's not so easily found that I would know about it. I'm a teacher. I have personal experience and I still don't know where to go with this. So everyone was like, yes, that's amazing. And I got external validation, which I would love to tell you doesn't matter to me. But like, it really did kind of give me the confidence I needed to like view this as a research topic. And I never changed my topic. I stuck with that the whole way through. That ended up being what my dissertation was on. And I worked with New York City youth, ages 12 through 17, and just did really like qualitative interviews with them and tried to present them as like a holistic child, like parental incarceration being part of your experience, but not the, you know, totality of your experience. Exactly. Like you have so many other things going on besides that, because sometimes, you know, part of doing your dissertation is doing a literature review. And I was reading some of these articles. I was like, well, this sounds horrible. This sounds bad. You know, there's one article, and I've gotten in trouble for this because, you know, in every field, there's like big people in the field, right? And so I was reading some of these studies by like big people in the field. And first of all, to read a study, you have to really go through everything. And there's lots of like, maybe, possibly, because you can't definitively say anything. But one thing that I noticed was that, you know, all these studies said that there's no causation between parental incarceration and these adverse effects, right? There's no causation. There may be some correlation, but then if you control for poverty and if you control for this, but they were still being presented as if parental incarceration was the reason for these adverse outcomes. And that really bothered me because I'm like, now you're perpetuating these negative stereotypes that we have, like, and let's talk about it, because children of incarcerated parents are reflective of the population. So they're overwhelmingly Black and brown kids. So now you're perpetuating these stereotypes on these Black and brown kids, and you really don't have the basis to do it because it's not causation. You're just looking at how, and everything that was being looked at was like negative. Like, oh, do they have problems in school behaviorally, academically? There was one study I read that talked about like, that looked at the maternal incarceration and the IQs of their children. And I was just like, why? Like, you know, being in special ed, IQ is like
it's more like a label or something like that.
Right. It's you know, there's been a lot of work done around IQs that say, and not to say that I don't think it could be a useful tool in some ways to kind of get an idea, but a lot of studies have said, you know, it's really motivation. You know, how well does the person want to do on the test? And then also some of them are biased, you know? So IQ is not the end all be all of everything for me. And then also, like, why would children of incarcerated parents have lower IQs? So there were just a lot of things like that where I was just kind of like, all right, but like, where's the good stuff? And I was like, you know, is there anything positive happening? And honestly, I started with like myself, because I was like, well, this isn't really my story. Like, I don't have a low IQ. I could do fine on an IQ test or whatever the case may be, or I did fine in school. I think I actually overachieved in school to compensate
As
for, yeah, like I think I was compensating for like this feeling of people gonna think something's wrong with my family. And I was like, well, who are you talking to? Like, how are you doing? And then a lot of the studies too, I found they weren't really talking with children of incarcerated parents. They were just talking about them. So I'm like, are you actually interacting with them? Are you having conversations? And it really just wasn't happening. So for me, it was really important to design a study where youth voices were at the forefront. They were able to share, you know, their experiences with schools. They were able to share their experience with their parents. And I didn't want to do it in a way that was, you know, glossing over, because parental incarceration is not fun for anyone. It's not something that I'm here to tell you is, oh, yay, super, it's no problem. Of course it has a huge effect. It's an impact. But one, it's a very complex and nuanced subject, right? Because your experience with parental incarceration may be different than mine, and yours may be different as well. You know, my father was already not living in the house with me when he was incarcerated. So not to say it didn't have an effect on me, but it didn't change my living situation. Whereas opposed to some kids have to move with a grandparent or go to foster care, which is another disruptor in their life, not necessarily the incarceration, but the consequences that come after the incarceration has a big effect too. So there just wasn't a lot of nuance to me at the time. I will say that I think the literature, the studies have gotten better. They're looking more at, and I have like a love-hate relationship with the word resiliency. They're looking more at resiliency and strengths and things like that. So I do think there has been that turn to strength-based approaches. But at the time, I was really just dismayed to be like, okay, like, I'm reading this as a professional and I'm also taking it personally because this is my story. And then I started getting this community and meeting other people who are like, I have an incarcerated parent that were, working in government or were doctors or, had their own organizations. And I'm like, okay, who's talking to y'all? Who's uplifting y'all or highlighting y'all so that people could see that parental incarceration is not this thing that has to define your life. And so it was really important to me taking that hat as a researcher to highlight, the goodness in children of incarcerated parents, in their situations, in the families that they come from. And hopefully I was able to do that. And so, I finished my dissertation, and then recently, it's not out for publication yet, but they're turning my dissertation, or I was able to convert it into a book. So it's going to be about children of incarcerated parents and supporting them in school settings. And it's coming out from Routledge in 2022. So I'm in the process right now of like making copy editor notes. I'm supposed to get the proofs of the pages in August. So I'm like super, super nervous and excited about it because it's not like traditional academic research. It's very, very like heartfelt. It sort of pushes back against like Eurocentric research ideas that you should be like dispassionate and objective and removed from your topic, because I'm like, nope, I'm fully in it. It's personal. I'm very passionate about it. I'm really excited about it. I care about it a lot, and I'm going to write about it too. So I don't know how it's going to be taken by the academic community, but I'm really excited that it's coming out.
It's good. As long, as you feel like, you got to express yourself in a way that your voice will be heard. I think that's what matters. Like you said, it's not really a lot of progress people could talk about, having someone who parent may be locked up themselves, or a student who may be locked up themselves, I feel like it needs to be out there. It needs to be known and clear that we need progress. We need resources like that.
Yeah, that's one thing that doing this work has really brought to light to me, is that there are some resources out there, like in New York. There's the Osborne Association, there's Our Children, there's LOHM, there's We Got Us Now, New Hour. But I also have noticed that they're very disconnected from what else is going on in the rest of the country. So, I knew what was going on in New York because I was in New York. Yeah. And then, originally I grew up in Maryland. So someone had DM'd me on Instagram that I grew up with. And they were like, hey, I see that you're doing this work. Do you know of any programs in Maryland? And I was like, I really don't, because my work was so New York based and the orgs were communicating with each other in New York. But the outreach to other states was like, how do we connect this? How do we get people in Maryland to know about what's going on here? And people in California, have their own initiative, like Ride the Bus to get to visiting and all these different great things that are happening, but they're kind of happening in isolation. And even me, like as someone I consider myself pretty involved in the work, or at least pretty up to date, I'm having trouble keeping track of like what's going on where and pointing people to resources, because I could give you the Osborne's website if you're in Maryland, and you could get book lists and some articles, but you can't go to Youth Action Council in New York because you're in Maryland. So I really agree with you. There needs to be support, there needs to be resource, and I think it would be really good, one, for the federal government to acknowledge what's going on and put some of those things out and put some things in place, because right now the nonprofits are doing all this work on their own to try to help in their community, and then try to do outreaches to other places so that these resources are getting to where they need. And then also sometimes I think some communities are left out, right? Like New York City has a lot of resources, as well it should. There are a lot of places in New York. I think there are three or five neighborhoods in New York that feed like 80% of New York jails. So there are communities in New York that desperately need programming because they have a large population of children of incarcerated parents. But then there are other places, like rural places, that also are dealing with,
Exactly.
the same thing, and they don't have access to resources or communities that they need as well. So I think that you're right. That's really important. It's something I sort of rack my brain over a lot to, like, how do we connect this? How do we get everybody to know what's going on?
First off, Dr. Whitney, I'm so honored to have you here today and to be able to speak with you for real, because like a lot of what you're saying is resonating with me. Like in school, I didn't realize that a lot of the things that I was going through had to do so much with my father being incarcerated, or had so much of an emotional effect on me. I went through, I believe, 5 or 6 high schools during my high school career. So I was in a private school, then I went to a school with like a high school with 6 different high schools in the one building, and then you had the charter school. It was an experience. I don't want to speak on a specific school and give the names and go into too much detail, but one of my experiences was there's something called a reflection room, and you get sent there if you're speaking out, if you're acting up or whatever, and it's a quiet room, and you sit there, and there's a laptop that you get, and the laptop is a survey about everything that you've done wrong, not what's been going on in the situation. So like going back to what you were talking about with reading these documents about how there were people talking about how we were the problem, how there's no flaw in our system, it's you. So what have you been doing? What part can you play in? But it's also about having that resource. It's about having a place to be able to communicate, to be able to say, hey, I'm going through this emotional turmoil because of this. But in school, it being a second home, sometimes it can be overwhelming with that transition of, okay, I'm a teacher, but what part can I play? What can I do? And at times we do tend to place the blame in other places, as well as place blame on ourselves a lot of the time. So all in all, my question to you is, what do you feel that teachers, or what do you think that the school period, those people that are in those positions, because not only teachers, we're talking principals, we're talking lunch ladies, everybody plays a role. So what do you think the school faculty can do to get back to being that second home, to being more empathetic with those students going through that emotional turmoil?
Yeah, so I like that term that you use, second home.
Yes.
Because I don't think a lot of people use that term or view it like that. And it really is, right? Kids spend a tremendous amount of time at school.
Yes.
And so one thing that I talk about in my book is, like, when we talk about these studies of children of incarcerated parents and how they do in schools, we're never critical of the school, right? We never look at, well, what is the school doing to support them? If you're finding that these kids are acting this type of way, then it's just like, oh, this must be parental incarceration. And it's never, what is the school doing? And as a teacher, I could tell you that I've had kids in my class that were fine in my class, and then they would go to another room for specials or something like that, and the teacher would be like, oh my gosh, they did this, this, and this. They can't be in school. And I'm like, well, if they can behave in one place, they can behave in the other. What's the difference? And the difference has a lot to do with the teacher. And Lisa Delpit, in her book, White Multiplication is for White Kids, talks about how there are kids who are school dependent kids, right? Who get a lot of things from school. They get food from school, they get nurturing from school,
clothing.
And all this type of stuff, all this type of things. And I think with COVID, we've seen a lot of what schools can provide, right? With COVID, we've seen schools sending lunch to kids' homes or becoming this place where they could go. So we've seen what schools are capable of, like being community centers, if that's what we want. Now, granted, this is in response to a pandemic that they were finally like, all right. Yes. But in general, that's how it should be every day, right? They should be a part of the community. But she also says that school-dependent children especially learn more for a teacher than from a teacher. So in the sense that if you have a good relationship with your students, then they're more likely to want to learn and do things for you to make you proud, to live up to your expectations. Unfortunately, what we have is a lot of people in schools who already have their own biases. They already have their own views of the children that negatively impact their relationship with the kids. And then the kids sometimes react in a way, understandably, right? Because as adults, we say, you treat me with respect, I'll treat you with respect. But kids don't get that same respect. But it's the same thing. You need to treat them with respect. Like, you can't sit there and act like they don't matter or they don't exist or, you know, all the type of stuff and then expect that they're just going to follow you with blind allegiance. Like, that's not what we want to teach them to do anyway. It's like, okay, you listen to everything I have to say, but also grow up to be a critical thinker. That doesn't align. You're not teaching them what you want them to actually do. That's not how it works. So I was a teacher. And I think, you know, some of the criticism of teachers is true. You know, I worked in a Title I school. Our population was over 90% Black. We were in Queens on the border, not too far from Long Island. And a lot of our teachers came in from Long Island and they were white women. And not to say that automatically makes you have certain views, but a lot of them did, like where we had to have real talks about like problematic things. Where you already are coming in with this savior complex that you're coming to help these Black and brown kids, and this is the type of families they come from, and the parents don't do this, and the parents buy them this. And I'm like, that's not your business. That has nothing to do with you. Your business is to make these children feel welcome in your classroom and to teach them. Succeed. So mind the business that actually pays you. It's not the one for you to judge everybody's house or home or what you think is happening, because you're not there. When's the last time you did a home visit? You didn't. So stop talking about it. So there's that part of it too, right? But I will also say that teachers are beholden to a lot of other people. So there's limits to what you can do. So, you know, even within the classroom, I was a child of an incarcerated parent, and I thought it was really important to have these conversations. But there was only so many spaces that I could try to have these conversations, because there was a million and one other things that, are you doing this? Are you doing that? And then on top of that, depending on the type of administration you have, you know, you might be risking your job doing certain things. And we've seen this time and time again, right? Teachers getting in trouble talking about LGBTQ plus issues, talking about like Black activists, things like that. I know for me, one of the things that I did was I co-authored a curriculum with another directly impacted educator. And it was designed as a school-based support. So like we really thought about teachers when they could do it, right? On their lunch, on their prep, because from working at a school, we know that if you're going to stay after school, you need a permit, someone's going to have to. So we're like, when could we do this? And so we designed it, and she was teaching in Buffalo at the time, and she piloted it in her school. And then I was like, well, let's try it in New York City. You did it upstate. Let's see if we could do it in New York City. And I was going to do it. I was going to do it for free. I was going to do it during my own time. And I knew for a fact that we had kids who could benefit from the program. And my principal said no. And there was nothing that I could do about that. She was like, you know, I don't want the parents to think that we think about them in a certain type of way. And I was like, well, from the fact that you just said that, I think you might think about the parents in a certain type of way, but really mass incarceration, I could go anywhere in this country and you could drop me off at a school. And I mean, goodness gracious, Jared Kushner had an incarcerated parent at some point. You could go anywhere. Not to say that's the same situation, but like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not indicative. It doesn't have to be in this certain neighborhood that we're saying something about the parents. We're trying to support the kids. And so I was trying to figure out a way around this, right? I was like, well, if you want me to go to the PTA and share my experience and my credentials and like why I want to do this, I will, because I've been at the school for, you know, X amount of years at this point. The parents know me. I could talk to them. I could share. And it was just a no. And so in the situation, I was left with like two things. Either I just take the no, or I go above her head to the superintendent. And then that makes a very tense work environment for you in the space that you have to be in. So there is a limit to what teachers can do. I don't think that means that they can't do anything. They can do lots of stuff. And I think a lot of that is like social, emotional piece, right? Like where you reflect on your biases, you reflect on the prejudice you have, you educate yourself about other topics. And you create a space that is warm and inviting for all children, regardless of whether you know they have an incarcerated parent or not. But I will say that I think larger scale change has to come from the top, to where chancellors are saying, this needs to be done in schools. This type of trauma-informed teaching, you have to learn about this. This is part of your professional development. Because I think if it's just left up to individual teachers, it's not going to happen. It's really not. So there are some things they can do, and then there are some things that we can't. And I want to have the conversation about what teachers can do, but I also want to acknowledge that other people have to do things as well, because I think sometimes teachers get the scapegoat thing put on them, where it's like, oh, well, the teachers aren't teaching this, or they're not doing this. And I'm like, there are a lot of logistics involved to where teachers can only do so much. And the environment, a lot of the New York City public, and I was in New York City public schools, but I'm going to assume it's not exclusive to them. The environment can be very toxic with your principals, whether you're getting tenure or not, what class assignments that you're going to get, just your overall work, your evaluations. I have a friend who's going through that right now. Her and her principal do not get along. She's an excellent teacher. Like, all the things you're talking about, she does. And she's getting poor evaluations because she does not have a good relationship with her principal. And she's a wonderful teacher. But, all of these things happen, and it's unfortunate. I think it's going to have to come from the top down for this to really infiltrate classrooms, because there are some people who want to do it and they're scared. There are some people who would do it and don't care. Me, I had tenure and I was kind of like, no, this is going to happen. But a lot of people don't. It's gotten harder to get. And then there are a lot of people who don't know about it to even, talk about it. If it doesn't affect them, they don't educate themselves to have the conversation. And then there are some people, being honest, that think if your parent is incarcerated, you're better off without them. There are some people who have that perspective and that view, and then they view the kids negatively, and they don't care to have the conversation. So they would have to be told to have those conversations. And, in my heart of hearts, I even wonder, would that be more traumatizing for kids to have someone lead this conversation that has such a negative view of people who are directly impacted by incarceration? So I don't know the answer to that. I think there needs to be a lot more education and learning, and I think people higher up need to make this a priority and decide how they're going to get this into classrooms.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, because personally, me, I was locked up. So when I came home after doing 2 years, it's just, for me, I try to get my life back together. So my main focus was to go back to school, do what I had to do, mind my business, right? I wasn't going to trip over nobody, I was going to focus on me solely. And it came to a point where I had a meeting, sat down with my counselor, my teacher, my principal. And my counselor told me, he stepped me away from everybody. He was like, listen, you're not going to graduate in time. And to be honest, if I was you, I'll just drop out. And I took his advice. And that set me for failure, But, I look at it now and I realize that I should have never listened to somebody like that who was so negative, towards my ideals. And, I should have continued what was actually beneficial for me. And seeing it, I just wonder how many other students went through that. Just not only me, because I went to that school. So imagine a counselor just telling me something, how many else other people's problem he will put out there or make them feel bad about themselves.
Yeah. So one, you shouldn't put that on yourself, because that's not the advice that anyone should give. Like, if you're in school, obviously you want to graduate. So then the path is like, okay, how are we going to get you to graduate? Not how are we going to get you to drop out? So I already know how to not come to school. I don't need your advice with that. So that's not on you for taking his advice, because let's be real, right? You're in a space where the school is a hierarchy, right?
Exactly.
So the teachers have some power. The principal has the most power, at least to the kids. Now, we know the chancellor and the superintendent, but when you're a kid or, a young person or youth in school, it's like teachers, principal. So you're thinking that these people, in a sense, know more than you in some ways, right? They have something to teach you, something to learn. So if this person who's supposed to help everyone is telling me, I can't do it, it's like, well, maybe I can't do it. So that's not on you. That's on them.
Yeah, that's something I had to realize. I had to move past on, and looking at it now, I regret making that decision. But I would say at the same time, not to blame anyone, but at the same time, it's just, if you're going to do a job, you shouldn't be,
You want me to blame him? I blame him. I'll blame him.
I ain't say it.
But
to say that.
Yeah, that's super unfortunate. And so okay, I'll give you an example. I told you I taught special ed in New York, right? And I had this girl in my class and I loved her to death. But before she came to my class, everyone was like, yo, she's the worst. this is elementary school. So they were like, this one, whatever. So I'm like, okay. So she came to class and she started, like, at the beginning, she would test out and I'd be like, all right. And then I remember one time I had a student teacher in my room and we were all on the carpet for math. And I was like, come over for math. And she was acting like she couldn't find, so she was mad about something. She flipped over her desk. And I just kept teaching. And then she went back and picked up her stuff and then came and sat on the carpet. And later the student teacher was like, oh my goodness, how did you do that? Like all this type of stuff. I was like, I didn't do anything. She wants to be a part of the group. You know, she did what she did, but ultimately she's a kid. Like she wants to come and do what we're supposed to be doing. She didn't get her way. But by the end of the year, we had like this awesome relationship. But she had an IEP. She was classified as emotionally disturbed. And eventually her family ended up moving down south. And I kept in contact with her mom. And her mom told me that she went down south and then she didn't have any IEP. When she moved, they didn't get her the IEP. She was no longer emotionally disturbed. And she was just in. So like these classifications, these things, these labels that we take very seriously are sometimes really subjective and arbitrary. Like in New York, you're emotionally disturbed and then you move here and you're not. Or, you know, this person tells you can't do it. And then it's so these things that, and I don't want to, you know, belittle the work that educators do. But, you know, it's hopefully a group of people, best case scenario, because sometimes schools are so overwhelmed, it's just one person doing stuff, but hopefully a group of people is making these decisions and trying to make the best decisions. And for the fact that he pulled you aside without everyone there, you know you're not supposed to be saying that, or else you just would have said it when everyone was there. But they're not the end all be all of everything. These are human beings making subjective decisions, you know. And hopefully if you're in a group and you're talking about it, you can kind of come to the best decision. But we also have to realize that, you know, teachers make mistakes. School psychologists make mistakes. A lot of kids are classified, you know, and then have to be declassified. And that doesn't always happen because sometimes the teacher just gets the IEP and they say, okay, well, this is what you are. I'm going to rewrite the IEP like that without really taking a look to see if a kid needed. I had a kid one time that they had in special ed and she was super like, you know, good with her academic subjects. I don't want to say smart because I think there's different types of intelligences that schools don't always measure. But she was really good with her academics. And really it was like her speech, but it wasn't a speech impairment. She had two parents. One, I hope I'm pronouncing this, spoke Quechua, and the other one spoke Spanish and Quechua. And so the dad would communicate with the mom in Quechua. He would communicate with the daughter in Spanish. And then she had to come to school and she was in an English. So she was just trying to figure out how to be multilingual. There was actually nothing cognitively going on with her. But like, and I declassified her. You know, she was in a self-contained and then she went to an ICT, which is a less restrictive setting. And eventually she went to a general ed classroom. But I'm like, if you're just a type of person who just writes down like, oh, this kid has it, and year after year after year, she might have went the whole way to high school in that type of environment. So you have to really look at, you know, the child and be willing to see what's going on outside of, you know, what other people are telling you or the person before wrote in their IEP. And I'll be honest, teachers are human. Sometimes teachers don't like a kid. Sometimes there are kids that rub teachers the wrong way for whatever reason. And it can be very difficult for them to separate that and still do what's best for the child. So I love teachers. I was a teacher. It's a hard profession and it's an amazing profession, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend that they're not human, that they don't make mistakes, that they're not subjective. That's all very true. And it unfortunately has an impact on a kid's life. Like for you to sit there and get up and say, oh, I think you should drop out, to someone who's trying to better their life, who's already been out of school, right? So like this is a big thing to even have to come back in here and do this. Like that's horrible to say. And you knew you were wrong or you would have said it in front of everyone. So you don't have to blame him, I blame him.
You highlighted something very important, and that was the IEP, how it really is just writing down on a piece of paper. Like for years I had an IEP and they wanted to put me on Ritalin, they wanted to put me on various other medications, and it shows you like how in the pharmaceutical comes into the education plan, how the teacher really does set the tone for how the educational pathway of a student will be, and also how the emotional intelligence, the lack thereof. I always had extra time on a test or I was in a smaller classroom, but it was really more so I needed a place to just exist and hone into skill and sharpen skill. So definitely we hope that the road to recovery for our educational system will be speedy, but also very thorough. We are indeed in need of a thorough reformation in all aspects, but especially in education.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I don't want to sit here and act like I'm a perfect educator. I wasn't a perfect teacher. You know, I lost my patience at times. There were some days where I was just like, okay, not today. But, you know, there were other times where I had a child, like, she had ADHD, and she liked to listen to music when she did her work. And she would stand up and put her headphones on and just bop away and do her work. And I was like, well, she's doing her work. Like, I'm not, but, you know, some teachers would be like, absolutely not. This is what a classroom looks like. You're going to sit down. You're not going to listen to music. But I was like, she's not bothering anyone. This is
okay.
Somehow this is helping her focus more. I don't know, because that's not how I work, but that's what she's doing. I mean, I had a kid, he got put on medication when he was in my class, and he slept all the time for like the first 3 weeks. And it's like, what do? You're not going to kick him out and send him to the principal's office. Like, his medication has to regulate to where he could get it together. But what you're saying is so true. I interviewed a girl in New York, and she went into foster care when she was young. And there were 4 of them, and they all got separated. At first, she was with her sister, and then they were in foster homes, and there was sexual abuse, there was physical abuse. And so she told me that at school, even the teachers would yell at her and make fun of her because she had never had her homework done. But she was like, there was no one to help me. Like, I was living in a situation where there was no one to support me. I didn't have clean clothes. They weren't buying me the right kind of clothes or whatever. So, like, there's this kid who both her parents have substance abuse issues. Her parents are incarcerated. She's being separated from her siblings. Imagine going through that at, you know, elementary age, and then you go to school and your teacher's yelling you about homework. She doesn't care about her homework right now. Like, you know, there's so many other things going on. And she just like took me on this journey on how it took her down this path. And eventually she got an IEP because she wasn't, you know, performing in school the way they thought. And then they put her on medication because they said she was angry, and the medication made her gain weight and it made her tired, which only amplified the problems, right? And eventually she said they tricked her. They told her like, oh, if you do this, we'll take you off the medication. And what they did was they sent her to a residential school. And so she got kicked out of regular school, and they sent her to this boarding school. And at the boarding school, she just told me, like, there's like this tier system, like you're always trying to work to get to the top because that's how you get visits and privileges, like basically how you get human rights is you have to work really hard. But, you know, she told me one time that a staff member just like elbowed her in the teeth. She's like, I've had black eyes if you want to see the picture. And I actually Googled the school that she told me about. And there's been numerous reports from that school of abuse, and it's still working. It's still, people are still getting sent there and all this type of stuff. And so to me, it was just like one example of her trajectory, like from a kid dealing with her parents having substance abuse issues, going to foster care, being abused at home, and then essentially being abused in the school system, right?
Exactly.
So like you said, her first home and her second home are now these places, these centers of abuse. And where do you go from there? And luckily, eventually her aunt said, no more, and came to pick her up, and now she's able to live with her aunt, and she's doing a lot better. She's an honor roll student. She wants to be a senator so she could help redo the foster care system, because she was really dismayed at how long it took for her family to be able to get her out of foster care. She's like, I don't understand, if my family's saying they want me, why do these strangers get to keep me if I could go with my aunt? And it took a long time. But like, she's using her personal experience now to try to help other kids, you know, who may be experiencing the same thing like her. But if she didn't have that one person, if she didn't have that aunt who was fighting for her, right, I don't know where she would be.
Exactly.
Who knows where that could have went. And so I think that's an important part too. And like, when we speak about like, what can teachers do? Like, never underestimate the power of your presence, because you might be that one person, the only person that saves someone from this path to that path. You might be like the person they look at and like, all right, the world's not all bad. Okay. So let me, you know, think about, I am worthy, I can do something. Because a lot of places, unfortunately, it's not just home that these situations are happening. School was reinforcing all of these horrible situations, whether it be with classifications or medication or just general attitudes towards the kids. So like, her story was so powerful to me, and I was so happy that she had that one person fighting for her. But for some people, they may not have that, and then we have to become
that refuge.
Yeah, we have to become the sanctuary. We're in the sanctuary. You have to become the sanctuary.
Sanctuary. Okay. Yes.
I want to say thank you very much for, speaking the truth. In reality, we need to, I feel like it's important to state out there what's going on and make it like normalize, right? Normalize it in a way that becomes applied in every school throughout every city in the United States, as that regardless, there's a lot of kids that go through it, and there needs to be a point where we stop putting labels on it and just be like, all right, boom. These are still humans. These are kids. We can't just treat them like whatever. We can't just say that in front of a kid, because at the end of the day, like I said, it might impact them. So I want to say thank you for that.
Thank you for being who you are and stepping up and in your lifetime utilizing your skills, not only your trauma, but turning it and flipping that switch into, I'm going to take this as a learning experience, as a teaching experience, and I'm going to allow my journey to inspire those that have those similarities to excel.
Yes, thank you guys for having me so much. I really appreciate it. And I just want to say that I'm so happy to see you doing this work, because when I was, younger and I was in youth, I didn't even know this was work to be done, and I didn't realize that too much later. So it just really makes me happy anytime I see, youth out here doing that, because you guys are going to be the next generation of people who get it to be normalized and humanized, right?
Yes.
My name is Elias Hernandez, and now that I shared my story, now that you know, I would love for you to share your story online. We offer resources, peer support groups. You can find us on the website. We offer mentorship, education resource centers, and you can also look us up on Instagram and TikTok. Thank you.